Many thanks to all of you who are here right on time, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. We'll wait just a couple of additional minutes for the rest of our stragglers to get here, if that's okay.
Instead, in addition to
Go away. She's on call. Go away.
what we cannot get right earbuds. I'll work with everything else except Zoom. I think so.
Oh, yeah, okay. I thought I'd wait until I was here. All righty, let's go ahead and get the ball rolling here. For those I haven't met, my name is Nancy Litz, and I am the co-chair with Amanda Packman of the Education Subcommittee of PI's Racial and Social Justice Committee. And welcome to all of you. We do have some stragglers still popping in, but we'll just let them straggle. Couple of tiny items. Number one.
No, I can't hear you and do this.
Could everyone please mute themselves so that we'll be able to hear our speaker? And if you are not already sufficiently familiar with Zoom, that this is old hat to you, you'll notice that up in the top right corner of your screen, you'll see some little boxes and the word view. When our program begins, you'll want to switch that setting to speaker view so that you'll be able to see both our speaker and his slide presentation to the maximum effect. And with that, I will turn it over to Terry Weiss to introduce our speaker. Terry, you're on and you're muted.
Not anymore. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Colin Gordon to you as our first speaker in the series. Colin is the F. Wendell Miller Professor of History at the University of Iowa. He's also a recipient of the University of Iowa Regents Award for Faculty Excellence.
Yeah.
University of Iowa Award.
I can't cast it. It's just a Zoom.
He's also the recipient of the University of Iowa Distinguished Achievement in Political Engagement Research and the College of Liberal Arts and Science Collegiate Fellowship. We met about a year and a half ago when Colin was in town at the invitation of Dr. Todd Swanstrom, making a presentation at the University of Missouri St. Louis Grand Center campus. And Todd was kind enough to introduce me to Colin. For those of you who don't know Todd, he's the Des Lee Professor of Community Collaboration and Public Policy. So it's nice to be surrounded by all these endowed professors. And Colin is going to endow us with information tonight regarding his book, Citizen Brown. But before mentioning Citizen Brown any further, I'd like to commend a prior book that Dr. Gordon also authored. It's called Mapping Decline, St. Louis and the Fate of the American City. And what he does in that book is take a residence at 4635 North Market Street and shows what happens when you institute policies and procedures that are detrimental to African American communities. He shows what happens at that residence, what happens in that neighborhood, what happened to the city of St. Louis, and then extrapolates it to show that the same pattern is present in cities across the United States. But for this evening, Colin's going to be talking about his more recent book, Citizen Brown, Race, Democracy, and Inequality in St. Louis Suburbs. So with that, I thank Colin for coming, and we look forward to your talk.
Thanks very much, Terry. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. Much of my presentation is based on the mapping I've done of the St. Louis area. And I'm going to concentrate mostly on the new book, Citizen Brown, but as a way of sort of setting that up, I'm going to draw in some of my earlier research on St. Louis as well to try and sort of tell as complete and coherent a story as I can of the sort of long history of racial segregation in St. Louis and in its suburbs. So I'm interested in, in some respects in sort of spinning the long historical backdrop to the death of Michael Brown on Canfield Drive in Ferguson in August 2014. And seeing that not just as a sort of a single event of police violence, but as something that has deep and multifaceted roots in the history of St. Louis. And so the organization of my talk looks like this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of the broader background across the metro area, and then focus in on the way in which, as I argue in Citizen Brown, citizenship is compromised and fragmented and segregated and ultimately arrested for African Americans in the St. Louis suburbs. Now, St. Louis is one of a number of settings that experimented early in the 20th century with explicitly racial zoning. As this map shows, trying to mark off those areas of the city in which African Americans were allowed to live. Now, this was passed by popular referenda in 1916, but it was short-lived because the Supreme Court struck down racial zoning a year later in the Buchanan v. Worley case. So in response, St. Louis realtors established what they called the unrestricted zone, which took in most of downtown and also those zones marked out by the racial zoning ordinance, and basically said realtors and landlords could sell or rent to African Americans within this zone, but if they did so anywhere else, they would lose their license. And that was buttressed over the next generation between the late 1920s, or the early 1920s and the late 1940s, by the spread of racially restrictive deed covenants in the city of St. Louis. These were smaller restrictive agreements. The yellow on the map here illustrates over 800 separate agreements, which set aside either city blocks or subdivisions or even individual property sales in such a way that prohibited African American occupancy. And the standard form in St. Louis looks like this. So this was filed with the St. Louis Recorder of Deeds, and it basically prohibited two what it called nuisance uses of property. One was to have a slaughterhouse, a junk shop, or a rag picking establishment, and the other was to sell, convey, lease, or rent to a Negro or Negroes. these, by the end of the 1940s, prohibited African-American occupancy on over a third of all residential parcels in the city of St. Louis. And as importantly, they were absolutely ubiquitous and systematic in the St. Louis suburbs, which were built a little bit later during the heyday of this form of restriction. And so you get subdivisions built in St. Louis County, which are, at the time they're built and marketed, proudly advertised as coming with protective restrictions, which almost always meant a prohibition against occupancy by anyone not of the Caucasian race. Now, what made these restrictions important for the long haul was that, even though the Supreme Court declared them unenforceable in 1948, in a case that came out of St. Louis called Shelley versus Kramer, they lived on in other forms. So this is a standard real estate appraisal form used in the city of St. Louis and in St. Louis County into the 1960s. And its basic criteria are racial influence, Negro population, encroachments, which in this case is an encroachment listed here of colored people, and the presence of deed restrictions. And so the valuation of property was tied directly to these sorts of protections. These covenants were also the keystone when the federal government got into the business of rating neighborhoods for residential mortgages. This was the origins of what we now call redlining. And so the red, and in this map, the yellow neighborhoods, which were the neighborhoods of African-American occupancy, were marked as unworthy of federally subsidized mortgages or home insurance. And in the wake of the Shelley versus Kramer case, these covenants were extended through the use of exclusive zoning, exclusive single-family zoning in the suburbs. And if you look at the sort of correspondence in the initial zone plans between city engineers and mayors and city councils, particularly in Suburban County, they refer explicitly to restrictive covenants and to their desire to sustain them in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision. Now, all of that yields a particular pattern of settlement and movement and migration in the St. Louis region. So in this map, what I'm showing is each white dot is the increase of 10 in the white population between the census years 1940 and 1950. And then a corresponding black dot for the increase in the African-American population. And then if a decrease is marked by a red dot for white persons and by an orange dot for black. So what we see here on this map is the impact of the migration from the South for industrial opportunities that came with the Second World War, but very much confined by that fabric of racial deed covenants. And so African Americans are moving into predominantly north and downtown St. Louis, whereas you can see from the red dots and the white dots in the suburbs, white residents of St. Louis are starting to move out. That becomes dramatically true between 1950 and 1960, when the population of St. Louis substantially begins its substantial depopulation. The city of St. Louis proper had a population of over 800,000 at the 1950 census, and it's now barely 300,000. And what we see on this map is not only sort of dramatic white flight out of the city, all those red dots are 10 white people leaving, but also the orange in this map, which signifies African-American departures, are the footprint of the first big urban renewal projects in the Mill Creek Valley and for the building of the first Bush Stadium. Those displaced large numbers of African Americans. Between 1960 and 1970, we see a continuation of the same problem, white flight now into the outer suburbs, and we're starting to see between 60 and 70, and between 70 and 80, also black flight out of North St. Louis into North St. Louis County, into those postage stamp municipalities, of which Ferguson is one, between the city and the airport. And then just scrolling forward to the present, we see the dramatic depopulation of North St. Louis, and even the sort of loss of population in some of the inner suburbs of St. Louis County, and a sprawling even further west of the population. This results in, among other things, a pattern of very dramatic residential decline and disinvestment, particularly in North St. Louis. So if we zoom in on this neighborhood, this is a fire insurance map from the early 1930s. And I use it just to show how densely developed this North St. Louis neighborhood is. 70 years later, all of these houses were gone. Dramatic vacancy and abandonment and tax delinquency across North St. Louis. The result of which is just not just a loss of a lot of the population and the housing stock, but a dramatic decline in the value of North St. Louis housing stock, which works to the detriment of African-American families who increasingly settle in North St. Louis. And one of the consequences is a dramatic gap in wealth by race. So, you know, as of 2016, all families, the median wealth, that is sort of right in the middle of the distribution, is about 170,000. For families with children, it's about half that. This is for white families. But for African-American families, the picture looks much different. They have about 1/8 of the wealth of all families, and African-American families with children at the median have zero wealth. That means half of all African-American families with children are in debt. And this is dramatically a legacy of this long pattern of housing discrimination, which and the absence of sort of intergenerational transmissions of wealth coming out of the middle years of the 20th century. So that's the backdrop. What does this mean then for African Americans, particularly in St. Louis County? One thing that interests me very much, and I'll come back to time and time again, is the fragmentation of the sort of municipal fabric in St. Louis County. So in this series of maps, the red areas show the single family homes by the year they're built. And then the green footprints are municipalities. And the tan footprints are when those municipalities annex new territory. And so we'll just scroll this forward a couple of years, get to 1930, 1940. What's interesting about this pattern of development is developers are going out into the cornfields of St. Louis County and building developments largely on unincorporated land. The incorporation and the use of formal zoning comes after the fact. So what that means is the private land developers are really making all the substantive decisions about how land is used. So as we jump forward, there's 1950, there's Creve Coeur right there. And you can see how sparsely populated it is at the time of its incorporation. And this is typical of St. Louis County. That is, incorporation was a way of sort of controlling future development as much as anything else. And I also want to note the dramatic increase in municipal incorporations between 40 and 50, because that's a reaction to Shelley versus Kramer. Because racial restrictive deed covenants can no longer be enforced, these subdivisions start to incorporate as municipalities. And so I'll just play that forward, 1960, 70, 80, 90. And you can see, you know, St. Louis County, as you all know, is a pretty densely urbanized suburban setting. Pockets of unincorporated land, particularly to the southwest, but as we'll see, also importantly, in some of the inner and central suburbs. Because in this process, there are African Americans living in St. Louis County in pockets of older settlement, one of which is Elmwood Park, which is an unincorporated pocket tucked between Overland and Olivette. Elmwood Park is platted in the 1890s and developed as a very rudimentary subdivision. It doesn't have any modern services. It doesn't even have paved streets when it's platted. And the lots are very small, 25 by 100 feet. And many of them are sold to African Americans, one generation removed from slavery, who are interested in living in St. Louis County because of the sort of deeply developing patterns of segregation in the city. Well, what happens over time, and these maps use the same logic as the earlier ones, so I'm showing here the contemporary boundaries of Overland and Olivette, and you can see how lightly populated they are in 1910. There's Elmwood Park. And then as we scroll forward, we get a little bit of more housing construction. And then in 1930, the municipality of Olivette is incorporated. And again, incorporation is largely seen as a means to control land use and control occupancy. In 1940, Overland is incorporated. And then both municipalities begin to add territory as new subdivisions are built. The final piece coming in 1965. But at this point, Elmwood Park, that blue patch in the middle, is still a pocket of unincorporated land. And the implication here is pretty profound, because all of those subdivisions cropping up around Elmwood Park are laying sewer lines, water lines, gas lines. They're bringing modern infrastructure. All of those dead end at Elmwood Park. And to add insult to injury, Olivette and Overland zone their land in such a way to quarantine Elmwood Park. They surround this pocket of African American occupancy with industrial zone land. The same thing happens in South County in Meacham Park, developed by the same developer in the 1890s, and it has the same trajectory. It becomes largely occupied by African American residents. In both Elmwood Park and Meacham Park, these early subdivisions utilize local rail lines to commute into the city or work locally. And we see the same pattern in Meacham Park, surrounded by Kirkwood, Sunset Hills, and Crestwood. Kirkwood's incorporated very early on. It adds territory. The incorporation of Sunset Hills and Crestwood come later. But as you can see, exactly the same pattern. Kirkwood is left in the middle, unincorporated, and cut off from the surrounding municipalities. And there's the zone map circa 1970. As you can see, Kirkwood, Sunset Hills, and Crestwood all surround Meacham Park with commercially zoned land. The only exception here is the southern boundary, but that's because that's set by I-44, a hard arterial boundary. So I call this, you know, the sort of suburban quarantine, and it happens to existing African American populations all across St. Louis County, in Robertson and Kinloch, North Webster Groves, and other settings. Basically, what we think of as suburban development, these sort of modern cul-de-sacs, move west from the city, but when they reach these pockets of African American occupancy, they break around them like they're rocks in a stream and just keep going. And again, they don't extend any of those basic services or infrastructure at all. So this has profound implications for the way in which citizens are served by their local government. And one of the most important of those services, of course, is schooling. And so here's an example. We'll move further north into St. Louis County to look at Kinloch. So Kinloch is this little pocket here in the middle of what's marked there in red as the Ferguson Florissant School District. But one can get a sense of the sort of deeply complicated history of Kinloch, which is another predominantly, in fact, 100% African American enclave at this point, if we look at the development of school district boundaries in that region. So this is what the school districts look like in 1936. So the school district boundaries, which are the shaded colors, are the Ferguson Florissant School District in yellow and the Kinloch School District in orange or tan. And the dark lines there are the municipalities. Well, the residents of the Kinloch School District who lived outside of Kinloch, who were predominantly white, were not interested in sharing a school district with African American children. Now, this was not an issue of schools, because by Missouri law in 1936, schools were segregated. So black children and white children did not attend the same schools, but they didn't want to share the tax base. And so in 1937, the residents create the city and the school district of Berkeley, which forms a donut around Kinloch and basically chops the Kinloch School District in two. And at that moment, the Berkeley district becomes one of the wealthier school districts in the St. Louis region, and the Kinloch School District becomes the poorest school district in all of Missouri by sort of assessed valuation and per pupil spending. And this was, candidly an effort to, again, separate those two revenue streams so the white students claimed the lion's share. There was no redress from this until a Justice Department lawsuit in 1975 that compelled the creation of the contemporary Ferguson Florissant School District. And as the Justice Department noted at the time, the cumulative effect of that split in the school district was a pattern of unconstitutional segregation in which students were denied equal educational opportunity. No more fundamental marker of citizenship than access to public schools. I'll give you one more example of the way in which sort of service provision is segregated in this way, and that is with infrastructure and services. So I've already alluded to the fact that modern subdivision development basically delivers what we think of as public services, sanitary sewers, storm sewers, gas lines, and water lines, that basically deliver them as private goods, as things you buy when you buy your home. And there's not much provision in these sorts of settings for providing services to older homes that have already been built up. And so in this series of maps, I'm showing the sewer infrastructure moving west of the city of St. Louis from 1920 to 1940. And as you can see, there's 1940. By 1960, the municipal sewer district was organized, and much of this is sort of stitched together into a modern metropolitan sewer system. But you can see Meacham Park there still has no sanitary sewers. They're in fact not extended until the 1980s. But importantly, what happens is the county gets a lot of money from the federal government to extend sewer trunks or main sewer lines into Meacham Park. But none of the residents can afford to connect their homes to those sewer lines. And most of those homes are not prepared for city water pressure or the like. So well into the 1990s, many of the homes in Meacham Park still relied on septic systems or outhouses. And then the sort of next element that I want to talk about is the way in which these communities are then disadvantaged by patterns of economic development or urban renewal. And so having, this is Elmwood Park, at the end of the 1950s, you can see the sort of pattern of development. Here's Meacham Park about the same time. On the right is the Meacham Park YMCA with outhouses out behind. And so what happens is when St. Louis County decides to get into the urban renewal game and apply for federal funds, to get rid of blighted areas and fix up neighborhoods, they identify every pocket of African-American settlement in St. Louis County as a target for renewal. And they explicitly make the argument that these people do not belong in suburban St. Louis County. They belong in St. Louis, where all the other African-Americans live. And so Meacham Park, North Webster Groves, Elmwood Park, Kinloch, Robertson, these are the targets of the St. Louis County Land Clearance for Redevelopment Authority. And here's how that plays out. So this is Elmwood Park, which is targeted for urban renewal. Here you see the aerial image of, again, this predominantly African-American neighborhood tucked between Olivette and Overland. Here's the urban renewal plan, which typically in these plans chops the residential footprint almost in half, and the gray area there is all set aside for industrial land. Here's Elmwood Park mid-redevelopment in the 1960s. And here's the result. Now, under federal urban renewal law at the time, if you were developing residential land for reuse as residential land, you were required to give the first option of moving back to the redeveloped neighborhood. The first option was to go to those people who lived there before. This map shows what happened to the residents of Elmwood Park during and after the urban renewal. So I've mapped 100 families that lived in Elmwood Park. And as you can see, one moves back. All the other families scatter to the wind. They move in with family or friends in such a manner as to deepen the segregation of the metro region, because you can see the families are moving to Kinloch, just to the north there, or they're moving into North St. Louis, Wellston, and the inner suburbs. And as you can see, scattering downtown actually do move into Pruitt-Ego and other public housing complexes. So this is a pattern of sort of expulsive economic development, designed and quite effective in its execution in removing an African-American neighborhood from the footprint of St. Louis County. Now, the residents of Elmwood Park take the Land Clearance Redevelopment Authority to court, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court by the mid-1960s. And in a sort of deeply ironic decision, the Supreme Court holds that the former residents don't have standing to sue because they no longer live there, which of course was the point of the lawsuit. But it's not until 3 years later in 1970 that the federal government establishes clear relocation guidelines for residential developments. But by then, of course, it's too late for the families of Elmwood Park. A similar pattern takes place in Meacham Park further south. So here's Meacham Park in 1955. And there's a appraisal and survey of the land in preparation for urban renewal in 1955. But those plans don't really come to anything, and all that happens is the city of Kirkwood annexes the frontage on Kirkwood Road that Meacham Park had, basically taking all of the commercially tax viable properties out of Meacham Park and bringing them into Kirkwood, but leaving the rest of Meacham Park as an unincorporated pocket. Now, over the next generation, there are numerous iterations of plans to redevelop Meacham Park or for Kirkwood to annex Meacham Park. As you can see here in this map, I-44 cuts across the corner of Meacham Park in the late 1960s. But this is a complicated debate because the city of Kirkwood is interested in annexing Meacham Park because they see it as an eyesore to one of the entrances to the city. But what Kirkwood is primarily interested in is extending policing into Meacham Park. And what Meacham Park residents are finally interested in is primarily interested in is potable water, storm sewers, and sanitary sewers. And they can't come to an agreement. In fact, this is not really sorted out until the 1990s when Kirkwood annexes Meacham Park in 1991 and then establishes an elaborate tax increment financing plan to redevelop much of Meacham Park as a shopping mall, what is now known as Kirkwood Commons. And so after promising to take only a little bit of Meacham Park for this development, they go much farther than they had planned immediately. This is a source of pretty dramatic tension from the 1990s on between Meacham Park residents and Kirkwood. And it's really the root of the Kirkwood city council shootings in 2008 because Cookie Thornton, an African-American contractor in Meacham Park, lobbied hard for the annexation and the development because he believed, or he was told, that he would get some of that business. None of the business went to contractors in Meacham Park. And of course, you know, Cookie Thornton, as most of you will remember, unraveled over time and went on a shooting spree in the Kirkwood city council buildings in 2008. You will also remember that there was a pretty dramatic confrontation of sort of competing expectations and competing explanations in the wake of those shootings. The Justice Department actually sent in a conciliation expert who a year later left town with his tail between his legs because he could not reconcile the bitterness of Meacham Park residents at their treatment at the hands of the city of Kirkwood over those many years. And the sort of Cookie Thornton saga, I think, is a nice segue to the final piece of my story, which is this pattern of predatory action by the police that leads to the death of Michael Brown. And, you know, I think the Cookie Thornton story is a good starting point for that, because what pushed Thornton over the edge was, in effect, a pattern of predatory code enforcement. When Meacham Park was annexed into Kirkwood, it also became subject to Kirkwood's building codes and zoning regulations, which meant that what Thornton had been doing for many years, which was stacking drywall in his driveway and parking his truck on the street, was no longer allowed. And he racked up nearly $200,000 in municipal fines before the shooting in 2008. Now, this, I think, as I say, gives us a backdrop to what happened in Ferguson a few years later. So this is the net result of that pattern, that deep pattern of segregation in St. Louis. This is from the 2010 census, and you can see what we call the Delmar Divide is very stark and extends, in a sense, out into St. Louis County, splitting University City in two. And the divide is actually starker in the county now than it is in the city in terms of marking off the boundary between inner North St. Louis County, which is predominantly African American, and South St. Louis County. And over time, that other boundary, between city and county, of course, eroded. That those institutions of segregation ultimately failed, and African Americans moved out of North St. Louis and into those North County municipalities. That movement of African Americans out of North St. Louis, that sort of pattern of black flight, was a movement into what urban demographers call secondhand suburbs. These are so Ferguson, Wellston, Normandy, these inner suburban municipalities have this earlier pattern of suburban development with relatively small lots by suburban standards. And they were the target of the sort of first generation of working class white flight out of North St. Louis. But they're secondhand suburbs now because they're going through this transition where the white families who settled these suburbs are now moving further out, out further in the county, right to St. Charles County. And African Americans from the city are drifting in this pattern of racial transition. The gentleman pictured here is Larman Williams, a middle school principal who was the first African American to buy a property in Ferguson in 1970. Now, all of this yields a challenge for the city of Ferguson. The city of Ferguson, again, is this target of white flight. Most of the individual subdivisions that make up the city of Ferguson were built with racially restrictive deed covenants. And indeed, as late as the 1940s, public records declare that the city of Ferguson prohibits occupancy by African Americans within city limits. But as it goes through this period of racial transition, driven by white flight out of North St. Louis, places like Ferguson, with their small lot zoning and and even some multifamily zoning, are really the only place that African Americans can go to coming out of North St. Louis. Because remember, African American families have very little housing wealth because of the past discrimination. So in the search for affordable and safe housing outside of North St. Louis, it's these older postage stamp municipalities that become the target. But what happens is property values, in part as a result, begin to fall because the demand collapses with white flight moving further west. And so as you can see in this chart of property values, Clayton and Ladue have relatively high median property values going up pretty much steadily over this time period. Whereas St. Louis is pretty flat, and those inner suburbs are even flatter. In turn, the inner suburbs of St. Louis County, Ferguson included, are hit hard by the Great Recession. Most of them, Ferguson included, between a quarter and a third of all property transactions in 2009, 2010 are foreclosures. And I mention all of this just to make the point that for the city of Ferguson, the property tax as a source of revenue is collapsing. Well, what about sales taxes? Well, the retail sales base is also migrating out of the inner suburbs. And Missouri has a peculiar sales tax system, which allows cities to either keep the sales taxes that are generated within their borders, or they can join a county-wide pool of cities that don't keep their property taxes. But of course, it's a beggar's game in the sense that all of the rich municipalities keep their sales taxes and all the poor ones join the pool. This also means there's intense competition for new retail development, which tends to suck retail development out to the newer malls that are further west. So what happens to sales tax revenue in Ferguson over this time period? It virtually collapses, as does, as I suggested earlier, property tax revenue. So the conventional sources of revenue for a small municipality like Ferguson are disappearing. It has one other option. Let me just, I guess I missed a slide. The one other option here is commercial or business property taxes. But unfortunately, what the pattern in Ferguson and other municipalities is to abate most of these, to give them away in order to attract new investment. So Ferguson has tax increment financing zones or enterprise zones, which forgive many of the business or commercial taxes. So the result is a pattern in which tax rates are higher and more onerous in the poorest of the county's communities. So we can look at this if we look at school tax rates throughout the county. So the small number written into each district there is the local levy, which can go up in 2013. I think it could go up to about 5 per 100,000. The shading shows how much those school districts are able to generate just from local revenues. And as you can see, the wealthy central county school districts, Clayton, Ladue, Parkway, generate over $15,000 per student just from the local property tax. Whereas the struggling municipalities and school districts, Normandy, Wellston, Ferguson, Florissant, not only can they not raise the money, but they've pushed their local levy up to its limit. And this results, the collapse in conventional revenue sources, in this sort of infamous pattern of what I and others call revenue policing, particularly in North County, where municipalities are increasingly rely upon court fines, code enforcement, and violations of municipal ordinances to keep the lights on at City Hall. So if we look at what this meant for the city of Ferguson, here it's conventional revenue sources, property and sales tax, fines and forfeitures become an increasingly important source of revenue, climbing to almost a fifth of municipal revenue on the eve of Michael Brown's death in 2014. So when Officer Wilson and Michael Brown confront each other on Canfield Drive in 2014, it's important to remember, as the Department of Justice underscored in the report that came out a year later, that the City of Ferguson Police Department was under explicit and expressed instructions to write as many tickets, and every time they wrote a ticket, add as many charges as they could, because this was important to the revenue stream for the City of Ferguson. And so that's, in a sense, what motivated Officer Wilson to stop, African-American teenagers whose offense was nothing more than jaywalking on the streets of Ferguson and surrounding areas. And so I'll leave it there. I'm happy to take questions. And on the slide here are some of the links and companions to Citizen Brown. There's a digital companion where there's some interactive versions of these maps and some of the sources that I rely upon. So the only question in the chat is, what time will the souffle come out of the oven? Are there any questions? Terry, do you want to field questions or?
Well, I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
You've explained how we got where we are. How do we get out of the mess we've created?
See, that's why I'm an historian. It's a difficult problem. And the first difficulty, which is an historical one, is that a lot of energy and a lot of resources, state, federal, and local, went into creating this problem. And those resources are not at our disposal anymore. The federal government basically does not have an urban policy, so we don't have access to the vast quantities of money that underwrote urban renewal and those sorts of big redevelopment schemes. And in the wake of, or for a variety of reasons, many municipalities are faced with the same sort of constraints that Ferguson has faced, not as severely. But Missouri, for example, passed what's known as the Hancock Amendment in 1980, which dramatically reduces the ability of municipalities to raise their property taxes. So it's difficult for local governments to do anything about these problems. And of course, the counties and the state are not major players in these. So what do you do? So one solution, I think, is to minimize the impact of fragmented municipal government. That is, minimize the ability of local governments to play musical chairs with business investment and to basically steal each other's tax resources in an effort to build better schools and safer neighborhoods. So we figured this out in some areas of public policy. For example, we have a metropolitan sewer district, because everyone knows that on sort of economic efficiency grounds, it doesn't make sense for every one of these little municipalities to have its own sewer system. You do that on a metro-wide basis. We also plan for transportation on a metro-wide basis, because the federal government won't give you transportation grants unless you have a metro-wide planning agency, which is in St. Louis is the East-West Gateway Coordinating Council. What follows from that, I think, is there's lots of other things that you could do regionally rather than locally. You could have some sort of regional determination of zoning, so that exclusionary and inclusionary forms of zoning were distributed more equitably across the municipality. And individual municipalities did not have the ability to say, well, we're just going to have 1 acre estates and that's it. You could have a regional authority for tax break deals given to business, so that these municipalities should not compete with each other to see who could get the next target. But instead, a regional authority would say, well, where would it make sense to put this? You could also, one way also to think about overcoming that fragmentation is to pool tax resources. So Greater Minneapolis, for example, pools all of their resources from the central city and the suburbs for funding schools. So the school's fiscal situation is not dependent upon the property value base, the local property value base. And you can actually, as a local priority, devote more resources to struggling schools. So those are some sort of basic strategies.
Darcy Scharf has a question. Have you looked at other metro areas, or do you know of other metro areas which are similar to St. Louis? What are some of the differences and similarities?
That's a really good question. So every city has its own story, its own sort of set of historical dynamics. St. Louis is, I think, set apart. St. Louis is exceptional in a number of respects. First of all, it's a border city. So like Baltimore or Washington, D.C., Louisville, Cincinnati. So it's a city that has an African-American population relatively early on. And what that means is that rather than dampening the sort of institute or the architecture of segregation, it exaggerates it. The city overreacts to the threat posed by the Great Migration and worries excessively about the spread of the African-American population that's already established in North St. Louis. So you have a much more extensive fabric of those institutions of segregation, race-restrictive deed covenants, exclusionary zoning, that sort of thing, because of the sort of nature or the location of the city of St. Louis. The other important thing, another important difference between St. Louis and other settings is St. Louis, like a lot of other Midwestern cities, is for most of this time period relatively unconstrained in its growth, right? So it's not going to run into any other cities going west pretty much until it gets to, Jefferson City or, so unlike in the more densely populated Northeast, if you think about Boston or New York City or Philadelphia, you can just keep building new subdivisions out in the cornfields of St. Louis County or St. Charles County and keep going. So you have that sort of outlet for white flight and for sprawl. And what makes that even worse in St. Louis is that the state of Missouri, which sets all of the rules for local government, has virtually no rules for establishing a new municipality until the 1980s. And so it's very easy to go out into St. Louis County and say, I got 6 houses, I got 6 garbage cans, I'm going to call myself a municipality, which is exactly what happens in Champ, Missouri, in St. Louis County, which has, about that many houses. It provides no city services whatsoever. And all these postage stamp municipalities exist primarily to control land use. So they become opportunities for segregation that don't exist in other settings.
Dr. Gordon, before we go to our next question, do you have the option to move out of share screen mode?
I do.
That would let us all see thank you.
Sure.
I think that'll make a Q&A a lot easier.
Okay, good point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I have one,
Sure,
if
Terry.
no one else does. There are about 50 examples of integration of systems between St. Louis City, St. Louis County, and the various municipalities within the county. You mentioned the Metropolitan Sewer District. There's also the Zoo Museum District, for example. And you also mentioned East-West Gateway Coordinating Council of Governments. There's also bi-state. There's also the St. Louis Regional Health Commission And there's other regional entities which can join the region in a very surgical way rather than en masse. As far as school districts, for example, the municipality of Creve Coeur, half of it is in the Ladue School District, and the other half is in the Parkway School District. Do you see, from a political standpoint, that there's any way, for example, to get school districts and municipalities more aligned?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And what's sort of fascinating about the sort of jurisdictional fabric of St. Louis County is that that question is almost never broached. They're seen as two completely independent systems. And partly, they have these sort of independent logics. You had, over time, from 1910 to the present, you have more and more municipalities, but the number of school districts has collapsed over the same period of time. So the school districts do see the benefits of consolidation, but if you go back to the map of the Ferguson-Florissant School District that I showed, it was born out of this tension between municipal and school district boundaries. Because what's interesting is the municipal boundaries determine land use, which determines the fiscal basis for the schools. And so when you have a very poor community like Kinloch and a very rich community like Berkeley in the same district, they try and pull apart, which is what happens in 1937. And, the current Ferguson-Florissant School District, I think, represents 11 municipalities, only 2 of which are entirely within its borders. So this is a problem across the county. But, the decision-making, aside from the ability of a municipality, the limited ability of a new municipality to also create a new school district, which is what Berkeley did, there's no mechanism to sort of connect those two. The county has very limited authority over municipal or school district borders, and the school districts and the municipalities basically, don't talk to each other about this question.
Are you familiar with the Freeholder Assembly as a mechanism for reconjoining the city and the county? And do you have any comments about the political viability of such a consideration?
Yeah, I looked at this historically, and the freeholders have been a venue through which the question of joining the county and the city back together again have been revisited about once a generation since the early 20th century. And each of those efforts failed. And they failed partly because, the freeholders, the Board of Freeholders is a venue for discussing this, but it doesn't have any authority to make it happen. And each time it sort of comes around, there are those who think that they'll win, and there are those that think that they will lose in the combination. And so even at a point where the divide was much more starkly between city and county in terms of fiscal stress and African-American population, many of the city wards turned down, in the 1980s, turned down the prospect of consolidation because they feared losing their local political power, that is control over ward politics, which is an important issue. There's also the question, if you combine St. Louis County and St. Louis City County into one entity, what happens to the municipal boundaries? And a lot of these discussions have included sometimes very elaborate plans for redrawing the municipal boundaries. But that's a source of resistance to consolidation, because however dysfunctional the entire patchwork is, people like their municipalities. They like the notion of home rule, the notion of having some connection to the people that run their municipality, perhaps knowing a member of the city council, that sort of thing. So, questions of combining municipalities or erasing those lines are really fraught. There was one in the 1980 freeholders discussion, I think it was 1982 actually. There was a really wonderful sketch that one of the planners did just during one of the meetings when they were talking about redrawing all these municipal lines. And so he took the St. Louis region, which has this sort of city of St. Louis and then this patchwork in the county, and instead he said, I have to remember I'm on Zoom, so everything's backwards. Instead he said, well, why don't we make these pie-shaped municipalities, start everyone at the riverfront and have it just go out into the county like this, basically dividing the region up, the way we've divided up the South Pole for research purposes. Everyone gets a footprint on the pole and then a pie slice going out from it. And this would, of course, give everyone, a little bit of post-industrial downtown St. Louis, a little bit of residential St. Louis, a little bit of inner suburb, and a lot of outer suburb. There, organize a school district, decide how you want to run your sales tax system, that sort of thing. So, I mean, to your point, Terry, it's unlikely to happen, but as a sort of thought experiment about what an equitable set of jurisdictional boundaries would look like, I think it's interesting.
Well, going back to what the question that Darcy Scharf asked earlier about comparing St. Louis to other municipalities, in terms of integration, reintegration of St. Louis City into St. Louis County, what are the similarities and differences between St. Louis City and St. Louis County and the city of Indianapolis and Marion County?
Yeah, so different state, every state has its own rules as to what constitutes a municipality, how municipalities are formed, what are the terms under which they can annex new territory, that sort of thing. It's common in states, for example, to not allow a municipality to organize right at the borders of another municipality on the grounds that should be an annexation and not a new incorporation. And so that's where the city-county line here has done so much damage. In a number of states, Indianapolis is a good example, many southern states are a good example, municipalities sit in the center of their counties. So Nashville is in the center of Davison County. Pittsburgh is in the center of Allegheny County. And so there's much better alignment between, particularly on issues of municipal boundaries and school district boundaries, between the central city and its suburbs. St. Louis, in that respect, is a little bit like some other cities. So the city of Philadelphia, for example, its boundaries are identical to those of Philadelphia County, and so it confronts its suburbs in the same way. City of Milwaukee is exactly the same. Milwaukee City and Milwaukee County have essentially the same boundaries. The suburbs are a separate entity. But if, as is the case in Indianapolis, Louisville, few other examples, Pittsburgh, if you can bring suburbs and the older central city into the same county, then you're a step ahead in terms of regional planning.
If St. Louis could reverse what it did in 1876, and St. Louis City could once again enter St. Louis County as a municipality, what are the legal steps that would have to be taken to accomplish that?
That's a good question, because, I mean, if you look at this historically, it's been reinvented every time. There's not a set procedure. So in the early 70s and early 80s, when this came around, it was a local referendum. So residents of the city and residents of the county both had to vote in favor. And either one voted in favor and the other didn't, or I think in 1970, both voted against it. But in the more recent round, in the Better Together fiasco, I mean, that was going to go to a statewide referendum, a statewide vote. So, you know, the procedure is not set in stone. And, you know, I think, you know, some sort of local referendum is probably the, you know, the most sensible and equitable way to approach that. But,
Because,
you know, by the same token,
Yeah.
by the same token, I mean, sorry?
No, after you.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, residents don't necessarily get a vote on something like an annexation. Like that can be done by a municipality. And so it, you know, legally, it could probably be done, you know, at a more administrative level through agreement between elected bodies. I'm just not sure after the Better Together fiasco that that's a good way to go.
Right. I was thinking one of the major concerns is disenfranchisement. And if the city were to re-enter the county, only the county, the 7 county offices within the city would be subject to disenfranchisement, which might make it much more appealing to city residents.
Yeah, I mean, there is a, you know, I mean, the fact that St. Louis is, you know, both a major city and a county means there is a duplicate, not, you know, a duplication in some respects of on things like policing and courts, but also things like, you know, auditor, assessor, recorder that are done in both the county and the city.
Well, for example, we used to have a metropolitan police department, and we used to have one police academy, which was nationally renowned. We could have a single metropolitan health district instead of the St. Louis County Health Department, the St. Louis City Department of Health.
Yeah, I think certainly, and you know, not to mention you know, where things are more fragmented in that they follow sort of municipal lines, the court system and the fragmentation of police departments, particularly through North County.
Right. Does anybody besides myself have any questions for Professor Gordon?
Terry, just before we get into any more questions, I just want to, my name's Amanda Stein. I'm one of the co-chairs with Nancy, and I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Gordon, for your wonderful talk. And, you know, if you're willing to stay and answer questions, that is fantastic. I did want to let everyone know that there will be a survey in your email about this evening's program. And also that we hope that you've signed up for our other speakers. And if you haven't, you are more than welcome to go to the Temple Israel website and do so. We have one March 8th where we're hearing from Senator Brian Williams, who is working in the Missouri Senate to create positive change through fighting systemic racism. May 10th, we have Dr. Howard Fields, the Assistant Superintendent of Human Resources for the Kirkwood School District, speaking about schools and educational funding. And then June 14th, we have Tony Westbrook Jr., who is the Assistant Director of Hillel at WashU, talking about racism and anti-Semitism in America. So I just wanted to thank everyone for coming. Thank you, Terry, for helping to organize this, and Nancy, and thank you very much to Dr. Gordon.
Yeah, I'm happy to keep taking questions. I saw one in the chat about parallels between the St. Louis and Memphis, which I think is an interesting question, because this is one of the differences between St. Louis and southern settings, particularly in school politics. So I argue that the fragmented municipal structure of St. Louis County was motivated in large part by the desire to sustain segregation, as we see in the sort of Kinloch school case, but also in the sort of motivation for the subdivision and incorporation existing outside of St. Louis County. Now, if you move south of the Mason-Dixon line, you see a very different pattern, because the school districts there are much larger, usually countywide, because Jim Crow allowed the absolute segregation of school buildings and the segregation even of school funding into black and white streams. So you didn't have that motivation to use municipal organization to accomplish segregation locally, and is, in a sense, accomplish on the fly, largely white schools and largely black schools. What we see in school politics playing out in the South is a very interesting pattern because, whole county districts worked well in Jim Crow, but after Brown versus Board of Education, and particularly in recent years, you see a lot of campaigns in the South to split school districts or to move wealthy fragments of school districts off into their own district. It's going on in places like Birmingham, Alabama, even as we speak. Other questions? Yeah.
I had a question to Marlita Weiss. Crime is such a problem in our area, literally. And of course, it's moving out to the suburbs. People are afraid to go downtown now. And I don't know how this relates to all of this, but it's a big part of our problem here.
Yeah, and I mean, it's very closely rated. The sort of crime that St. Louis suffers from disproportionately is a product of concentrated poverty. And poverty is concentrated by historical patterns of segregation. And so these are sort of, as I argued in my talk, sort of deeply woven through St. Louis's history. We measure segregation in the social sciences by a couple of measures, one of which is what's called the dissimilarity index, which is you look at a whole metro area and you say, okay, so the African Americans are 25% of the population in greater St. Louis. But in any given part of St. Louis, that ratio is very different. So that index is how many people would have to move from one area to another so that every part of greater St. Louis had that same distribution. The other measures we use are an isolation index and a concentration index. And those are the ones that are directly related to crime rates. Because if your only option is to live in a neighborhood of concentrated poverty, that is a neighborhood in which economic opportunities stifled, in which educational opportunities are stifled, in which the only people who remain in the neighborhood are those who can't afford to get out, or who those actually thrive on that atmosphere. But that, again, it's all a legacy of this deep pattern of segregation.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm David Kripke. Thank you for coming and speak to us, by the way.
Sure.
But my question goes back to the city-county consolidation. I once heard, I think it was on NPR, criticism of that once you do consolidate, particularly when you get to regional economic development type committees, there was a tendency there, they said, I don't know whether it's true, but to take resources from the central, like Indianapolis, and send it to the already wealthy suburbs. My brother lives in one of the suburbs, and in visits, over the last few years, you can see that there's been a lot of development out. Now, I don't know what it's like in the city, but have you ever heard of that kind of a problem coming up from consolidations?
Yeah. And it could result from consolidation, or it could result just in one of those settings where the central city is in the middle of a county. Because the challenge is that it's much more expensive to reclaim, old industrial and residential areas than it is to just build a new one. So the incentive from the sort of market incentives and the tax abatement incentives to build suburban campuses for businesses or to build out is still there. There's some very good work, for example, on the city of Nashville, which again is in the middle of Davidson County, Tennessee, and yet it's rather than take advantage of that fact, sort of disconnected pattern of decision making has allowed things to sort of spill to the outside. And that has to do with where you build your roads, where you build your schools, where you choose to make those investments. So I think a consolidation would have to be premised upon and accompanied by a pretty rigorous commitment to regional equity. Where do we, and which would simply disallow a tax abatement in an area that doesn't need it. And by the same token, there would be some uncomfortable conversations about, more inclusionary patterns of zoning where it currently does not exist. So, yeah, consolidation itself does not necessarily determine what kind of decisions are made within the larger jurisdiction, but I think that commitment could accompany consolidation. Other questions? Just, I can't see everyone on the screen, I don't think, so just speak up if you, well, I guess everyone's on there now.
Yes, so Dr. Gordon, my name is Cindy Jones, and I wanted to thank you, first of all, for Citizen Brown. It helped some people that I love finally understand the systemic and structural nature of racism when I got them to read that book. Listening to the history, it feels really easy for me to feel like that's history, it's done. There's nothing I can do about it as an individual. And at the same time, I know those things are still happening. I know that Wildwood was incorporated as early as 1995 in direct response to a developer petitioning to build multifamily housing in the area. And so it's still going on. I think the methods that we're using just have evolved and changed a little bit to things like nuisance ordinances. Are there any other practices that as an individual citizen I could be on the lookout for that would be an indicator that there's an attempt to segregate or fragment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think we're, and I like the way you put it earlier, because that's sort of the frame I often use as well, which is that the impulse to segregate is distressingly constant across this period. It's the mechanisms that change, right? So the Supreme Court says you can't do this, so you do something else. Where you see decisions that I think fundamentally reinforce segregation occurring today are decisions about economic development, because we have an economic development system, a system of tax abatement, which is, because it's not very generous, means that the investments go where they would have gone anyway. So, you subsidize the building of a shopping mall in an area where the developer would have built it whether they got the incentive or not. And those developers, whatever incentive you give them, are not building in distressed areas. So economic development, although it sits behind the facade of the sort of public interest and building a job base and that sort of thing. In fact, if you look at the math of tax increment financing in the St. Louis district, it's sprawling west faster than everything else. The other area is school politics. So school politics is the one place where you get, I think, veiled arguments about segregation, because people talk about good schools instead of talking about schools with white kids in them. It becomes, or they talk about buying a house in a neighborhood that has good schools, which, becomes a mechanism by which, without ever using a racial reference, you tend to entrench those patterns of segregation. Well, if you move there because the schools are good, then, it's just building that property tax and it's making the school better and it's impoverishing somewhere else. Now, this is not to say that I necessarily think individuals should make the opposite decision, because that's a big sacrifice to ask, a parent to make. I think the goal is to have people aware of what that decision means and what its sort of deep historical roots are. but I firmly believe that the impetus lies on public agencies, on school districts and local and state governments to create different opportunity sets for individuals and parents and families that they can operate within.
Do you think there's any possibility of having a moratorium or regional moratorium on tax increment financing? The most egregious example of that I've seen lately is when McKelvey got tax increment financing to redevelop the old Post Dispatch building, which he already owned, which means he was going to go ahead and do the project whether he had tax increment financing or not. And of course, for every dollar he got in tax increment financing, 60 cents comes out of the pocket of the St. Louis Public Schools. How would you deal with that?
So a number of states have broached this, and some quite successfully. And the simplest way to do it, short of having a regional board, is just empower the school district to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down on tax increment financing, because it's basically calling their bluff. If a developer says, "Oh, this is gonna pad the tax base, so that 23 years from now you will get more tax revenue off this property," the school district is in a position to say, "Well, we have a long experience with this, and we know that that's not the case." It's not the case in part because a lot of money is thrown at projects, in central St. Louis that aren't going to sustain their value 23 years from now. And the evidence for that is that most of the tax increment financing done in the city is on properties that received previous forms of tax abatement. And just over and over and over again. The St. Louis City School Board actually did, in the 1970s, did a report on the first generation of tax abatements, and found, as you describe, that it was people who already located in the city of St. Louis getting the abatements, so it wasn't like they're coming from somewhere else. And in every single case, 10 years later, when the abatement expired, the property was worth less than before the abatement. And all of that money came out of the school district's pocket. So, yeah, so I would say the first rule is give school districts a veto. And the second rule is never, never, never TIF retail. Because you're providing a tax abatement on the assumption that you're creating something of value. Shopping malls don't create living wage jobs, so there's no reason to subsidize them. And there's not a shopping mall in the world that is worth more as much 23 years in the future as it was at the time the taxes were abated. And in fact, what we see in St. Louis County is once they reach the end of the abatement, they look for another one in another mall. The Target in Kirkwood Commons moved 1 mile in order to restart its tax abatement. So a question from on the charter school question. I'm not, I don't claim a lot of expertise on school finance, but I think the embrace of charter schools is it's a dodge of the hard questions. It's and in effect, it sort of, as it's occurring in the city now, I think it caves into the sort of pattern of disinvestment and decline rather than leaning in against it. So, we do have a number of schools in North St. Louis with small student populations. So you could, on simple efficiency grounds, make the case for closing them. Now, keeping a school open doesn't guarantee a neighborhood stability, but closing certainly kills it. And we know from St. Louis and other settings that where and how you open or close schools, whether those schools are public or charter schools, and where you decide to locate new schools has a huge impact on demographic movement. And so, you know, if you want to save or rehabilitate a neighborhood, the first thing you have to rehabilitate are the public and private goods that neighborhood leans upon. So you can't have food deserts, you can't have no schools, you can't have high levels of crime. You need to, you can't expect, you know, that the home ownership to come first and rebuild that level of public goods and public trust. So I think, you know, in most settings where they are well established, charter schools have been something of a disaster, partly for the damage they do as students take their dollars with them out of the public system, which works to the benefit of the students that remain, but also partly because, and most profoundly, you have public dollars being spent in ways that are not accountable to the public. You know, we have elected school boards and transparent school budgets for a reason, and I think we should sustain it.
Dr. Gordon, you have been incredibly generous with both your information and your time. So now that we've imposed for an additional half hour, I think we'll say goodnight with a huge thank you from all of us and a commitment to do some more homework and see about ways that we can